Long before the rivers learned their names, before the forest paths hardened beneath human feet, the elders of Okoyong said this. When a stranger comes with fire in her heart and dust on her feet, watch her closely. She may be a storm or she may be rain. This is the story of Mary Slessor, the woman the people would later call Abangawan Okoyong, the white queen who did not rule with iron but with stubborn love. But she did not arrive as a queen. She arrived as a tired woman with cracked shoes, fierce blue eyes, and a voice that refused to be silent. The drums knew she was coming before she did. Deep in the forest, where the ancient Irako trees held memories in their roots, storyteller Ekp sat by his fire and listened to rhythms carried on the wind. The drums spoke of change. They spoke of a woman who would challenge death itself. Mark this day, Ekp told the children gathered around him. The forest is preparing for someone who will not bend easily. And in Aberdeen, thousands of miles away, a young woman stood at a loom, her fingers bleeding from cotton threads, dreaming of horizons she had never seen. In the far northern land of Aberdeen, where the sky was often gray and the air smelled of salt and smoke, a girl named Mary Slessor was born in 1848. Her mother, Margaret Slessor, was a washerwoman whose hands were always red from cold water. Every morning before dawn, Margaret hauled heavy buckets from the well, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. She scrubbed other people's linens until her knuckles cracked and bled, singing hymns to keep her spirits high. Her father, Robert Slessor, drifted between work and drink like a boat without a paddle. He had been a shoemaker once, skilled with leather and all, but the bottle had stolen his steadiness. When he came home late, the children learned to make themselves small and silent. By the time Mary was 11, she was already a mill girl, waking before dawn to the scream of factory whistles. The textile mill was a cathedral of noise and dust. The looms roared like hungry beasts, their mechanical jaws snapping thread into cloth with relentless precision. Cotton dust filled the air, coating lungs and clothing with fine white powder. Children coughed and worked and learned endurance before joy. Mary worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Her fingers grew quick and clever, dancing between threads that could slice skin if handled carelessly. The other mill girls talked of marriages and market days, but Mary's mind wandered elsewhere. But Mary had a strange gift. When the machine screamed, she listened for stories. She saw patterns in the weaving, not just of cloth but of lives intersecting, threads pulled tight or left loose. She watched the older women, hunched and gray before their time, and wondered if there was more to existence than the endless clatter of looms. At night, when other children slept, Mary sat by the fire while her mother read aloud tales of faraway lands, of Africa, of jungles, of men and women who crossed oceans to heal and teach. Margaret Slessor had little education, but she treasured the few books they owned. By candlelight, she would read missionary journals, her voice bringing to life worlds of heat and color, of rivers wide as seas and forests thick with mystery. One name burned brighter than the rest: David Livingstone. The great explorer and missionary who had died in Africa, his heart literally buried in the soil he loved, his body carried by faithful companions back to England. Mary heard stories of his courage, his compassion for enslaved peoples, his determination to bring light to places others called dark. Mary whispered that name like a prayer. Someday, she told her younger siblings, I'll go where he went. I'll help people who need help. They laughed, not cruelly, but with the practical disbelief of children who had never traveled beyond the city's edge. But Mary didn't laugh. She saved every penny she earned. She studied every book she could borrow. She memorized maps of continents she'd never seen. And when her father died, pickled by drink, buried in a pauper's grave, Mary felt something shift inside her. Grief mixed with a terrible freedom. She was no longer trapped by his chaos. She was 28 years old. And she heard a voice. When Mary was 28, she heard a voice, not from the sky but from deep inside her bones. Said go. The United Presbyterian Church was recruiting missionaries for West Africa. Calabar they called it. A place of heat and disease, where white missionaries often died within months of arriving. They called it the white man's grave. Mary applied immediately. The church elders were skeptical. A mill girl? A woman? Alone? With no husband to guide her? I don't need a husband, Mary said firmly. I need a ship and a Bible. They saw something in her eyes, something fierce and unbreakable, and reluctantly agreed. So in 1876 she boarded a ship bound for West Africa, carrying little more than a Bible, medical supplies, and a courage that frightened even herself. The Ethiopia was a merchant vessel that stank of palm oil and sweat. Mary was given a tiny cabin below deck, barely large enough to turn around in. She didn't complain. She stood at the railing for hours, watching gray waters turn blue, then green, then blue again. The ocean tested her. Storms tossed the ship like a child's toy. Sailors cursed. Mary prayed. She was seasick for the first week, clinging to her narrow bunk as the ship pitched and rolled. Other passengers, merchants and colonial officers, avoided her. A single woman traveling to Africa was either mad or desperate, and they weren't sure which was worse. But Mary befriended the crew. She learned their names, asked about their families, tended to their cuts and fevers with the medical knowledge she'd acquired from borrowed books. By the time they crossed the equator, even the gruff captain smiled when she appeared on deck. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Slessor," he told her one evening as the sun set like a blood orange over endless water. "Perhaps both," Mary replied. When land finally rose from the horizon, thick and green and steaming with life, Mary did not know she was stepping into a legend that would outlive her flesh. The coast of Calabar appeared through morning mist, a wall of vegetation so dense it seemed impenetrable. Palm trees towered like sentinels. The air was heavy, wet, and smelled of earth and salt and something ancient. Mary stood at the railing, her heart pounding. This is it, she thought. This is where I belong. She didn't know yet about the twins. About the poison cups. About the funeral practices that would turn her into a warrior. She only knew that the voice in her bones had gone quiet, replaced by a certainty as solid as stone. She was home. The land of Calabar welcomed her with heat so heavy it pressed against her lungs. Stepping off the ship was like walking into an oven. Within minutes, Mary's dress was soaked with sweat. Insects hummed in clouds. The sun hammered down without mercy. Duke Town, the main settlement, was a collision of worlds. British colonial buildings stood alongside traditional compounds. Trade canoes crowded the river. The air rang with Efik, English and a dozen other tongues. She met Chief Akong, stern and silent, whose eyes measured her like a riddle. The chief sat in the shade of a massive tree, surrounded by advisors. He wore traditional cloth and coral beads, his face marked with ritual scars. When Mary was presented to him, she didn't curtsy or bow. She met his eyes directly. "You are very small," Chief Akong said in careful English. "Small things can be strong," Mary replied. Something flickered in his expression, amusement perhaps or respect. He nodded slowly. "We will see." She met Mama Ndem, the market woman whose laughter shook her whole body. Mama Ndem ruled the central market with cheerful authority. She sold yams and palm oil, pepper and dried fish, her voice booming above the crowd. When Mary came to buy supplies, stumbling through basic Efik phrases, Mama Ndem laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. "You speak like a baby bird," she declared, then immediately took Mary under her wing, teaching her proper pronunciation and market customs. She met Reverend Hugh Goldie, a fellow missionary who warned her gently. "This land will change you, Mary. Or it will break you." Reverend Goldie had been in Calabar for 20 years. He was thin and yellowed from repeated bouts of malaria, but his eyes were kind. He showed Mary the mission compound, the small school, the rough dispensary. "Most new missionaries spend their first year in Duke Town," he explained. "Learning the language, adjusting to the climate. It's dangerous to rush into the interior." Mary smiled. "Then let it try." She had no intention of waiting a year. Mary spent 3 months in Duke Town, but they felt like 3 years. She studied Efik with obsessive focus, practiced her limited medical skills, and listened to every story about the interior regions. Okoyong, they told her, was different from the coastal areas. More traditional. More dangerous. The people there had resisted European influence, maintaining customs that horrified the missionaries. "They still practice slavery," one missionary warned. "Human sacrifice. Trial by ordeal." "Then they need help," Mary said simply. Teacher Ima, a young Efik woman who worked at the mission school, volunteered to accompany her. "You cannot go alone," Ima insisted. "You don't know the paths. You don't know the protocols." Together, they traveled upriver in a canoe paddled by local men. The journey took 2 days. They passed villages built on stilts, fishermen casting nets, crocodiles sunning on mud banks. The river narrowed. The forest closed in. At night, they camped on the shore, and Mary heard the forest for the first time, truly heard it. It was not silent. It hummed and clicked and roared with invisible life. Birds called in languages she couldn't comprehend. Something large moved through the undergrowth, making the leaves shiver. "Are you afraid?" Ima asked. Mary considered. "Yes, but I'm going anyway." When they finally reached Okoyong, Mary saw a village unlike Duke Town. Houses built of mud and thatch. cooking fires sending smoke into the canopy, children playing in the dust, and watching from every doorway, suspicious eyes. A stranger had come. The drums began to speak. In Okoyong, whispers followed Mary. The villagers had never seen anyone quite like her. Her skin was impossibly pale. Her hair was the color of rust. She wore strange clothes and spoke their language with an accent that made children giggle. But stranger still was her fearlessness. She walked through the village as if she belonged there, greeting elders respectfully, accepting offers of food, sitting with the women as they pounded cassava. She didn't flinch from the heat or the insects or the stares. She learned of a terrible custom. Twins were feared, believed to be cursed by evil spirits. Babies born together were abandoned in the bush, or worse. The belief was ancient and absolute. Twins were seen as unnatural, a sign of adultery or witchcraft. The mother of twins was often accused and punished. The babies themselves were taken to the forest and left to die, killed by exposure, wild animals, or simply neglect. Mary's blood ran cold when she understood. "This cannot be true," she said to Elder Abasai, keeper of traditions. "It is our way," he replied calmly. "It has always been our way." "Then your way must change." Elder Abasai's expression hardened. "You do not understand our world, white woman." One night the forest cried. Mary was in the small hut she'd been given, trying to sleep on a mat that barely cushioned the hard ground. The heat was oppressive even after dark. Mosquitoes whined around her ears. Then she heard it, a thin, desperate wailing. She was on her feet immediately, grabbing a lamp and pushing outside. Teacher Ima tried to stop her. "Mary, no. That sound, it's from the Forbidden Grove." "I don't care." Mary followed the sound and found twin infants, wrapped in leaves, their tiny fists clenched against the world. They were perhaps a day old, barely moving, their skin covered in ant bites. Someone had laid them in a shallow depression and walked away. She did not hesitate. She carried them home, one cradled in each arm, their small bodies hot with fever. The villagers gasped. Word spread instantly. By morning a crowd had gathered outside Mary's hut. Elder Abasai pushed through, his face dark with anger. "You are inviting death into your house," he warned. Mary was washing the babies with clean water, picking insects from their skin. She didn't look up. "Then death will have to wait." She named the twins Janet and Joseph, raising them as her own. It was an act of defiance that should have gotten her killed or exiled. But Mary had already begun to weave herself into the village's fabric. She'd treated sick children. She'd helped with harvests. She'd listened to the elders' stories without judgment. And she was undeniably strange enough that normal rules seemed not to apply. Word spread like wildfire. Some called her mad. Others began to call her mother. And in the forest, storyteller Ek added new verses to his songs. In Okoyong, when a chief died, his wives were expected to follow him into death. The practice was called death marriage, the belief that a chief needed his wives and servants in the afterlife, and so they must accompany him. Some went willingly, drugged or devoted. Others were forced. Mary learned this when Chief Io Honesty II fell ill. The chief was old, respected, and dying slowly from a wasting disease. Mary had been treating him with what limited medicine she possessed, but they both knew the end was near. His youngest wife, Erit, barely 16, wept as preparations were made. Mary found the girl behind one of the compounds, surrounded by older women painting her body with ritual marks. Erit's eyes were swollen from crying. "Please," Erit whispered in Efik. "Please, I don't want to die." The older women shushed her sharply. Mary's jaw tightened. She marched directly to the council of elders, interrupting their preparations. Warrior Edom, a scarred man who served as enforcer of traditions, stepped forward to block her. "This is not your concern, white woman." Mary stood before the council, heart pounding. "This is murder," she said clearly in Efik. The elders laughed. "You do not understand our ways," Elder Enisei replied. "The chief needs his companions. It has always been so." Mary stepped forward, past Warrior Edom's warning hand. "Then let me learn, and let you learn mine. If your gods demand death, let them take me instead." Silence fell. It was such an outrageous statement that no one knew how to respond. Challenge the gods? Volunteer for death? This pale woman with her strange beliefs was either divinely protected or supremely foolish. "I will stay with the chief," Mary announced. "I will care for him until he passes. And no wife will be harmed." She stayed by the dying chief day and night, refusing to leave. When he died 3 days later, she physically blocked the ritual, standing between the wives and death. The executioners approached with knives and poison. Mary stood firm. No spirit struck her down. The forest remained silent. And in that silence, something ancient began to crack. Warrior Edom lowered his weapon. The gods have not taken her. The crowd murmured, uncertain. Elder NSA raised his hand. We will consider this matter further. It wasn't a victory. It was a delay. But ere it lived another day. That silence changed everything. Another trial awaited. A man named Eudophia was accused of witchcraft by his neighbor. A child had died, and suspicion fell on Eudophia, who was known to be a skilled herbalist. In Okoyong law, accusations of witchcraft were resolved through trial by ordeal. The accused was forced to drink poison. If they survived, they were innocent. If they died, guilt was confirmed. Mary learned of this when she heard drums calling the village to assembly. By the time she arrived, Eudophia was already bound, and Nurse Bassie, a local woman Mary had been training in basic medicine, stood in the crowd, her face pale. They will kill him, Bassie whispered. The poison is too strong. Mary pushed through the gathering. Colonial Officer Thompson was present, a young British administrator who had traveled from Duketown for trade negotiations. He watched with uncomfortable fascination, not intervening. The village elder held up a clay cup filled with dark liquid. Ground seeds of the Ezra bean, Mary realized. Deadly. She seized the cup and smashed it against the ground. The crowd gasped. If your gods are just, Mary cried in Efik, her voice carrying across the assembly ground, let them judge me instead. No one moved. Mary stood in the spilled poison, her feet bare, her dress stained. She met Elder NSA's eyes. I am telling you that this is wrong. This man should be judged by evidence, not poison. If you want to prove your justice, find the truth. Officer Thompson finally found his voice. The Crown does not recognize trial by ordeal. The Crown is not here, Elder NSA interrupted coldly. But he was looking at Mary, not the British officer. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Elder Abasai spoke. Let the man go. We will seek other ways to know the truth. The poison ordeal ended that day. Not immediately. Not completely. Old customs died hard. But Mary had planted a seed of doubt, and doubt was the beginning of change. Eudophia, released and trembling, bowed deeply to Mary. She helped him to his feet. Go home to your family. That night, Nurse Bassie came to Mary's hut. You could have been killed today, Bassie said quietly. I know. Why do you risk so much? Mary looked at the twin babies sleeping in their baskets, at Janet and Joseph who had survived against all odds. Because someone has to. Years passed. Mary lived like the people, barefoot, sweating, sick with malaria more times than she could count. The fever came in cycles. Chills that made her teeth chatter, heat that made her delirious. Each time she thought she might die. Each time she recovered, though each bout left her a little weaker. She learned Efik, Ibibio, and local dialects with obsessive thoroughness. She could argue in 3 languages, joke in 4, and pray in 5. She argued with chiefs about justice and mercy. She nursed the sick with whatever supplies she could gather or make. She built schools with her own hands, laying mud bricks and thatching roofs alongside village men who respected her calloused palms. Children followed her everywhere. They tugged at her skirts, held her hands, climbed into her lap. She told them stories, Bible tales mixed with Scottish folk legends, creating new mythologies. She taught them to read and write, both in Efik and English. She adopted more children. Not just Janet and Joseph, but orphans, abandoned children, those considered cursed or unlucky. Her compound became a refuge. They called her Abongawan Okoyong, the White Queen. But Mary never ruled. She served. She sat with grieving mothers. She mediated disputes between families. She negotiated with traders who tried to cheat villagers. She stood between angry mobs and accused individuals, demanding evidence before punishment. The village transformed around her, slowly, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. Twins began to be kept, not killed. At first hesitantly, families who were too afraid of Mary's wrath to abandon babies. Then more openly as surviving twins grew healthy and strong, disproving the curse. Widow killings decreased. Trial by poison became rare. Mary didn't do this alone. Teacher Ima became a fierce advocate. Nurse Bassie trained other women in basic healthcare. Even some elders like Elder Abasai began to quietly support reforms. You have bewitched us, Elder Abasai told Mary one evening, but he was almost smiling. If I have, Mary replied, it's with nothing more than stubbornness. When colonial authorities arrived in force, chaos followed. British administration was expanding inland. Treaties were signed. Trade routes formalized. And with colonial power came colonial law, often imposed without understanding or respect for local customs. Disputes turned violent. Traditional authority structures clashed with British courts. Villages that had governed themselves for centuries suddenly answered to district officers who spoke no ethic and understood nothing of local protocol. Mary found herself in the middle, translating not just language but entire worldviews. Unexpectedly, Mary was appointed magistrate, the first woman to hold such a position in the British Empire. Colonial Officer Thompson, now promoted to district commissioner, made the unusual recommendation. "She's the only person both sides trust," he wrote to his superiors. "The locals respect her. She understands their customs. And she's British enough to represent Crown interests." It was an uncomfortable compromise for everyone. British officials were scandalized. A woman? A missionary? With no legal training? Okoyong elders were suspicious. Was Mary now the white man's tool? Mary herself had deep reservations. She had no love for empire. But she reasoned that if someone was going to impose external law, better someone who cared about justice than someone who cared only for order. She wore no robe. She sat beneath trees just as traditional elders did. She listened before judging. Her court was unlike any other in the region. Both British law and traditional custom were considered. Compensation rather than imprisonment was favored. Reconciliation was the goal, not punishment. Chiefs respected her. Even warriors lowered their voices in her presence. Warrior Edom, who had once threatened her, became an unlikely ally. "You are strange," he told her, "but you are fair." Mary mediated land disputes, marriage conflicts, trade disagreements. She handled cases of theft and assault. She refused to judge anything involving witchcraft accusations, insisting those be handled by traditional authorities who understood the complexities. And slowly, painfully, two legal worlds began to learn from each other. Mary's greatest legacy, she believed, would not be legal reforms or saved lives but education. She built schools throughout Okoyong. Simple structures at first, thatched roofs, dirt floors, benches made from split logs. But they were filled with children eager to learn. She trained teachers. Teacher Ima became headmistress of the largest school. Others followed, young people who had grown up in Mary's compound and now dedicated themselves to education. The curriculum was a hybrid. Reading and writing in both Efik and English. Mathematics and practical skills. Bible study but also traditional stories and history. She wanted children to be rooted in their own culture while gaining tools for the changing world. Not everyone approved. Some British missionaries thought she was too lenient, not focused enough on conversion. Education should lead to salvation, they insisted. Some traditional elders thought she was corrupting youth with foreign ideas. Mary ignored both criticisms. Children need to think for themselves, she told anyone who would listen. They need to ask questions. They need to be prepared for a world that will not be exactly like the one their parents knew. The schools flourished. Within a decade, literacy rates in Okoyong were higher than in many coastal areas that had been under British influence for generations. But progress came at a cost. Mary's health continued to deteriorate. Repeated malaria infections had damaged her organs. She developed chronic fever, joint pain, and periods of breathlessness. She refused to rest. "There's too much to do," she insisted, even as Nurse Bassie begged her to take time to recover. She collapsed one day while teaching, simply crumpling to the ground mid-sentence. The children screamed. Teacher Ima sent for help. When Mary woke, she was in her own bed, surrounded by worried faces. Janet and Joseph, now teenagers, held her hands. Other adopted children clustered around. "You frightened us," Janet said, her voice shaking. Mary tried to sit up and couldn't. Her body simply wouldn't respond. For 3 weeks, she was bedridden. The village held its breath. Rumors spread that the White Queen was dying. But Mary was too stubborn to die yet. She recovered, though not completely. She would never again have the boundless energy of her younger years. She moved more slowly, tired more easily. But she didn't stop. "I'll rest when I'm dead," she told Nurse Bassie, who rolled her eyes but helped Mary to her feet. After nearly 40 years, Mary's body weakened dramatically. She was in her mid-60s now, ancient by the standards of West Africa where so many died young. Her skin was weathered and scarred by tropical sores. Her hair had gone completely white. She walked with a cane. Malaria bent her spine. Fever clouded her sight. The mission board in Scotland sent urgent letters. "Return home. Retire. You've done enough. Mary ignored them. She continued teaching, though she could now only manage a few hours before exhaustion forced her to rest. She continued mediating disputes, though she had to sit the entire time. She continued caring for her adopted children, though there were now so many they had children of their own. Her compound had become a small village itself. 3 generations lived there, children she'd saved, now adults with families, all looking to her as matriarch. Still, she refused to leave until carried. The mission board sent a representative, Reverend MacDonald, a kind-faced man who had known Mary in her youth. "Mary," he said gently, sitting beside her as she rested in the shade. "You've given everything to this place. You've earned peace." "This is my peace," Mary replied, gesturing at the compound where children played and adults worked and life continued. "Then at least come back to Scotland to recover. Just for a few months." Mary was quiet for a long time. Finally she nodded. When she finally returned to Scotland, she longed for Africa. Scotland felt alien now. Too cold. Too quiet. Too structured. Her sisters and brother were strangers, their lives incomprehensible to her. They talked of parish politics and social events. Mary talked of forest spirits and tribal councils. They had nothing in common anymore. "My heart is buried in Calabar," she told anyone who asked about returning permanently. She gave lectures to raise money for missions. She met with church officials to advocate for better support for missionaries. She wrote letters constantly to her adopted children, to teacher Ima, to the chiefs and elders. But mostly she counted the days until she could return. She returned one last time in 1914. She was 66 years old, frail and sick, but determined. The ship journey nearly killed her. She spent most of it in her cabin, feverish and weak. The captain tried to convince her to turn back at the first port. "I'm going home," Mary insisted. When she arrived in Duke Town, a crowd waited. Word had spread that Abongawan Okoyong was returning. The journey upriver to Okoyong took 3 days instead of 2. Mary had to rest frequently. Nurse Bassie, now an old woman herself, traveled with her. "We should have stayed in Scotland," Bassie scolded gently. "Then you should have stayed," Mary replied. "I had to come back." When Mary's canoe rounded the final bend and Okoyong came into view, drums began to beat. The entire village turned out to greet her. Janet and Joseph, both now in their 40s with children and grandchildren of their own, waded into the shallow water to help carry Mary ashore. She was home. Mary's final months were spent surrounded by family. Her compound was always full. Children came to hear stories. Adults came for advice. Chiefs came to discuss village matters, still seeking her counsel even though she could barely speak above a whisper. She spent her days sitting in the shade, too weak to stand for long, but her mind remained sharp. She dictated letters, gave instructions for the schools, planned for the future. Teacher Ima visited daily, bringing reports on student progress. Warrior Edom, old and scarred, came to sit silently beside her, keeping watch as he had in the old days when danger was everywhere. Even Elder Nsa, ancient and blind, was carried to see her. "You changed us," he said simply. "We changed each other," Mary corrected. She knew she was dying. The fevers were constant now, the pain unrelenting. But she faced it with the same stubborn courage that had carried her through everything else. "I'm not afraid," she told Janet one evening as the sun set red through the trees. "I know, Mama," Janet whispered, holding Mary's frail hand. Mary Slessor died on January 13, 1915, in the early morning hours. She slipped away quietly, surrounded by her adopted children, in the house she had built with her own hands. The forests of Nigeria mourned. Drums beat slowly, carrying the news from village to village. The rhythm spoke of loss, of gratitude, of a light that had gone out. Women wept openly, clutching twins to their breasts. Men bowed their heads, remembering a pale woman who had never been afraid. Chiefs came from across the region for the funeral. British officials sent delegations. Missionaries and traders, village elders and market women, warriors and teachers, all came to honor the woman who had changed their world. Twins were held high and blessed, living proof of Mary's legacy. They buried her in Calabar, not Okoyong. The mission board insisted on a proper cemetery. But her spirit, everyone knew, had never left the forest. Even today elders say, "If you walk deep enough into the forest at dawn, you may hear footsteps." That is Mary Slessor, still checking on the children. Her house still stands, preserved as a memorial. Pilgrims come from across Nigeria to see where she lived and worked. Her schools continue, now government institutions educating thousands. Her adopted children's descendants number in the hundreds, all carrying forward her legacy of fierce compassion. Her name still lives in songs and stories. Storyteller Ekp's great-grandson tells tales of Abangawan Okoyong to new generations. And the fire she carried, the fire of courage, compassion and defiance, has never gone out. In Scotland there is a statue of Mary Slessor, but the people of Okoyong say she belongs to them. She was not a conqueror or a colonizer. She was a woman who listened, who learned, who loved stubbornly. She challenged death and won. She challenged injustice and did not back down. She challenged both her own people and her adopted people to be better. And in doing so she became something neither entirely Scottish nor entirely Efik, but something new, a bridge between worlds, a translator of values, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. The drums still speak her name. The forest still remembers. And somewhere in the green shadows, footsteps continue walking, checking on the children, making sure the fire still burns.